My name is Michael Wood. Since the age of 17, I've been willing to die in service to my community. In the U.S. Marine Corps, I was Sergeant Wood.
Michael Wood spent 11 years in the Baltimore Police Department.
Michael Wood is a very honest individual. He was not liked by the Baltimore City Police because he didn't play the good old boy network game.
As my career developed, I set out to understand why people offend, instead of how they offend.
The reason why these consent decrees don't do anything is because there's no enforcement or changing of the mechanism of incentives for the officers. So all you're doing is talking about it.
I certainly was going to cross. I was ready to shoot if I had to, but I was never going to cross that line.
But you kind of wanted to shoot.
Sure. Get what you inspect, not what you expect.
So, or anywhere that's populated, is your metric is based off of arrest. So you don't actually go out and engage with the community, because that would be time that you could be getting the arrest that you're expected to get to prove that you're a decent officer. So you actually don't have any incentive to communicate.
Michael, we should be looking for goals to not have people end up in the criminal justice system. Instead, every solution we have is to push them into the criminal justice system.
It should not be up to Jeff Sessions to determine how Baltimore Police Department operates. It should be up to the residents of Baltimore. Jeff Sessions doesn't know anything about policing, never has and never will.
I want to read a quote that you gave the Washington Post, which struck me. You said, "When you work in policing, you're inundated early on with the us versus them mentality. It's ingrained in you that this is a war, and if someone isn't wearing a uniform, they're the enemy. It just becomes part of who you are, of how you do your job."
What I'm trying to say is that we are looking at people who are doing nothing new, and if we focus on the actions, then we can fix the things for next time. Because when you focus on people, we end up thinking we can chop the head off, they put a new person in and something will change. But if we don't focus on the methodologies and the institutions, then we will be
put them in a prison cell, do the paperwork, go back out and do it again. So what we really need is to change the incentives and disincentives so that no matter what the role, we're still going towards that objective that actually serves.
More occupation, more vehicles, if your answer continues to be violent, because we have to understand that everything about policing is inherently violent. I have come in there with authority and told you what you will do.
All right, let's talk about the mainstream media.
Well, I mean, our PR discussion formally kind of blends into the news issues.
Yes.
And
I forgot how I framed this in my message to you. I hope you remember.
Yeah, I don't remember. But like, it's just really, it's becoming very hard to shift through what is real and what is not. And I imagine what got you onto this topic was, what did Trump say? There's something about like having the licenses revoked of the press. And that obviously evokes this immediate thing where you're like, whoa, what? But when he says, like, they're fake news, bro, like, they are. And I don't know how we get past that as a society right now.
Okay, yes.
The whole point of news is supposed to be that they present this objective bias on our airways, or objective journalism, sorry. On our airways.
Objective bias is actually, I think, a good way to put it, but we'll go back to that.
Yeah, we should define that term later. That would be an interesting one. In exchange for the free use of the airwaves, they have to like allow presidential discussions and things like that. That's essentially the system that's laid out for if people don't know. So they use the airwaves for free because they're supposed to be telling us the truth and reporting journalism, exercising the First Amendment rights. But in like the last few years, I just went through a quick one real quick and like think about some of these things and how they've affected the public perspective. One thing. So the first one that we had, since we were talking about PR, was the whole threat that he was going to abandon PR. Like, there's no real threat of that. There's no threat of abandonment. That's just simply not what took place. He said we couldn't stay there.
Bro,
I don't want to argue it.
As a subject, as a colonial subject of America, believe me, we can be abandoned.
But I understand, but that's not what he said. And
I
so
understand,
my comment,
but that's what
my first
can
comment
happen.
on that. My first comment on that is were they not already abandoned?
Yeah, no, I mean that was
note.
actually my next comment too. Is like actually we were kind of abandoned before this happened, so this isn't like a new abandonment.
Right. So like I kind of said, like, is that like I don't think he made that threat. And then really, is that an actual threat? Because
Yeah,
I'm pretty
no.
sure that's
It's more like a description of the historical situation.
right.
Fuck you
And
guys.
so, like, here's a couple more of them. Trump blowing a kiss to Comey. Comey hiding in the curtain. Near Gorsuch's Fascism Forever Club. So, do you remember that, where he was supposed to be some writer?
Vaguely.
Gorsuch? Right. And so everyone thought he had this racist background and all. None of that was absolutely true. It was a complete joke. It was done as sarcasm, where other people were in on it, and it was explained to be this sarcastic thing. Like, it's so ridiculous. It would be so ridiculous to have some kind of right-wing racist idea like that. And it got all blown up.
Sure.
And Comey was never hiding in the curtains. Trump never blew a kiss to Comey when you watch the video in its full context. They had that. There was a story about mobilizing the National Guard. Do you remember that? He was going to mobilize 100,000 National Guard members, and none of that was ever true, ever took place.
So let me just ask. I mean, because you're right. There's no question that the media gets shit wrong, right? Like, putting aside the question of whether they're pursuing the truth, there's no question that they get things factually wrong all the time. Now, part of that is just a function of the way we have structured media, which is to say that we have non-specialist reporters, right? And what a reporter does is they go and ask somebody a question, and then they come back and report it. And I think we'd both agree that's not an ideal situation, to the extent that we've lost an opportunity to vet that information we're getting from the official channel, because the person's just turning around and parroting it. And to the extent we maybe get a challenge to that official narrative, it's because the reporter asked another expert who then challenged it, or a quote unquote expert. So I'm not going to disagree with you that the media gets things factually wrong. I did want to ask, before I say my comment, whether you think of yourself as part of the quote unquote resistance to Trump.
No.
Okay.
Not at all. I think that is an incredibly scary idea. And like, I have a huge problem with Cenk Uygur right now in TYT, and one of the arguments he's making, trying to encourage people and Vice President Pence to go and use the 25th Amendment to claim that Trump is mentally ill in order to take over. And we want that calculating demon in office? No thanks.
No, yeah. And so I would agree. So, but to the extent that there is a group that views itself as the resistance, is it fair to say that they rely on the mainstream media's coverage of the Trump presidency?
Yes.
In order to essentially fuel their information or data collection for the sake of their resistance?
Yes.
And so the reason I wanted to talk about mainstream media, or the role of media, is precisely to point this out, that there's a tendency on the left to complain about the media, especially when it makes mistakes, and especially when it makes mistakes on factual matters about which we have a deep-seated commitment. So issues of race, or, gender, really issues of power disparity. But nonetheless, I don't understand where else, other than the mainstream media, this supposed resistance, whether we identify with it or not, thinks it gets its information. And so there's this tendency, I think, to say that because the media isn't perfect, or because it doesn't wholly validate our worldview, that it's therefore, to put it in Bannon's terms, the opposition, until they are seemingly on our side, right? If they were criticizing Bernie, we might be upset on the left. But if they're criticizing Trump, we're happy. And so I think we have to reach a point, and this is like a broader conversation about our political situation. We have to reach a point where we speak out of a single side of our mouths about what the press is. Is it a problem, or is it our ally in the resistance? Because right now I'm confused, because I see people who want the press both to be the bad guy and the good guy.
Yes, I'm totally with you. And, I don't have opinions that go with the masses, and that gets me in trouble a lot.
No, I mean, this is part of why I wanted to have the Puerto Rico discussion first, because I didn't... I feel, I do feel like the episodes where we disagree with each other are a little bit more interesting, probably, for the audience.
Probably.
Because otherwise
but
we
I
sit
think-
here going like, I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. I agree.
So I want us to get two terms really like clarified in our discussion
Sure.
on this, and this is where my objection comes in, and why when I say Trump is right on this, he is right that they are fake news, and what I mean by that is they're literally not news. These places now that we're getting our information from, they're visual op-eds. They're not news. And those organizations have the First Amendment privileges and they have these airways because they're supposed to be press and journalism, which is not op-ed. It is that factual thing. It is that objective reality of something. So when Trump is saying, like, to take these press passes away, I got to be able to see it from his perspective that if these people are nothing but op-eds and they're going to get in that room and say, I was in the room with Trump and this is what happened, and everybody runs off with this crazy story, then you might as well be like, well, then fine. Nobody comes in here, so you can't make up some crazy-ass story op-ed. I heard Rachel Maddow the other day talking about Russian infiltration of the election process, talking about Facebook ads that had like 30 views and how that was sophisticated Russian trafficking to change perspective of people. And it's like, that's ridiculous. And it's like TYT, who we talk about and people think of as progressive news, like, one of my big objections and arguments that I have with them is that there is nothing about them that is news. It is all op-ed,
Yeah.
and they're not clear on that. And you have to be clear that you're op-ed. So there's these whole lines that everybody gets, because what these stories are really doing is they're taking a few AP stories and a few real journalism issues and articles that get printed, and then they're all running with that one very narrow perspective.
As we say in hip hop, facts. But let me problematize some of what you're saying. I do think there's an extent to which you've reduced news to cable television news, and I don't think that all news is of that ilk of like Rachel Maddow, which is no question the opinion side of journalism.
But that is who Trump's talking about.
No,
and
I understand, but for example, when he's complaining about the NBC story, right? That is not opinion journalism, for example, right? Like that's based on conversations with people in the administration who made this claim to the reporters, and they ran with this story. And so
these sources are a problem. Let's hit that. Remember that. That needs to be a side note.
I understand.
When we talk about tyranny. When we talk about tyranny,
okay,
it's
so
a huge issue.
We'll go to that. That's the next episode for the audience.
Tyrannical, yeah. Okay.
That shit is coming, but it should be noted that journalism in this country, and I think something like the Federalist Papers speaks to this, right? Because these were essentially sort of essays under secret authorship that were published in newspapers, and this is how these debates were had at the founding stages of the United States of America. But regardless, journalism has always had a sort of factual reporting side and an opinion side. And they're both news, they're just different types of news, and they should be clearly distinguished because the opinion shouldn't be given as though it's factual reporting. And I think that's valid. But going back to the term that I think we accidentally invented, I'll give you credit for it, objective bias, I think is exactly how the left needs to understand media, or the resistance needs to understand mainstream media in the American context, right? Because the American experiment is an essentially Enlightenment experiment. It is an experiment to create a system of government based on Enlightenment values. And among those values is free public debate and the importance of access to information so that persons can make their own decisions about important issues. And this is a descendant of a Protestant value that asserted priests should not be the sole possessors of the holy text and the sole interpreters, that people should have direct access to these things and make a decision on their own. But to the extent that the Constitution protects the free press, it essentially creates a press for the explicit purpose, not of defending truth abstractly, but of defending the sort of Enlightenment values that form the basic boundaries of our system of government and social organization. So I think the role of the press in the American system is precisely to operate within that Enlightenment value system, which I do think it broadly does and the mainstream media broadly does. I think that's problematic from my own sort of post-colonial perspective. But America's not a post-colonial experiment. And so I think in that sense, I think the left needs to be clear about what the role of media is. And if it thinks it should be something different, then we can have that conversation. But it can't say it's supposed to be something different, because I don't think that's just accurate within the context of our own history.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I want to define it by something because of a precedent, which I don't know, like what you're saying, if it even is a rational precedent. But that the exchange of public airwaves, so the public air is our public property. And these mainstream media, these networks, so what I'm going to define as news for the context of this discussion is purely what uses our public resources in order to convey its messages. And those public airwaves are ours. Legally, they're ours. They're not the they're not CBS's airwaves. So when they use those airwaves, that is under the idea that they would be a check and balance on the government, and that check and balance is not from opinion. That check and balance is of investigation and fact and like discussion, argument. It is not in having that bias. So I'm okay with totally redefining and having discussions about what news really is, about what the role of the free press should be. You know me, I'm totally for changing the Constitution at any point in time. I think that the only thing about it that's intelligent is that it can be changed. But the idea of being able to have the truth at our resources, I think should be very clearly not something that can be op-ed.
The only place where I disagree slightly is that I do think that to the extent the opinion side is an attempt to articulate how the facts should inform our decision making within the context of Enlightenment values, because you're right that the airwaves are public, but they're public and they're a public possession of the person of our nation, right? Which is this Enlightenment experiment. It's not public in the sense of like you and I as individuals outside of our construct as citizens in America have access to.
Well, we do have a patented restriction from using it, though.
No, of course. But again, because there is this broader structure of nation that has been established that we're all sort of participating in. And so
right, but our liberty as a public has been restricted, which is like extremely critical at its core foundation of American values.
Yeah, but that's also the operative understanding of what government does, which is why in a lot of ways our government is set up in the ways that it is in terms of its particular details. There is an express awareness in the Enlightenment tradition that government infringes upon natural liberty, but that not inherently bad. It just depends how far that infringement goes. And so I do think the opinion side of journalism is a necessary part of journalism to the extent that that opinion side is supposed to protect whether you're from the left or right wing perspective of how those Enlightenment values should operate.
Totally agree.
Yeah,
if you're clear that it's op-ed. So Maddow doesn't say this is op-ed commentary.
But I mean, the way the networks generally, you're right that there's not like something that says flash op-ed. A lot of the networks will distinguish like their news hours. Fox is very famous for doing this from their opinion hours, and Maddow being prime time with Chris Hayes and Reverend Sharpton and what's the other guy, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, yeah. Right? Like these are all their essentially they're color commentators, right? These are the guys who are essentially the sports version of journalists.
The public is not. No, you're totally right, but the public is not perceiving it that way because it's not conveyed.
I think it. Let me ask: do you think the public has some responsibility to not be completely fucking morons? Because like if you're watching Rachel Maddow and then Chris O'Donnell, and you're like, yeah, facts. God damn, that's kind of on you, bro. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, you know, I don't fundamentally believe in personal accountability, so
That's true.
no,
That is true.
it doesn't fit my worldview.
It doesn't. Sure. I'm sorry, man. I have to. I do believe in personal accountability, and I think if you're watching Rachel Maddow or Chris O'Donnell, and you're like, and even just the presentation of the way they like present their arguments in their animated way of working. If you think that's like pure factual, if you see that and you're like, yeah, that's like the same as what Connie Chung used to do when she would read the news on headline news. I kind of feel like, as citizens, especially in a democratic context where there's this idea that government is not only for the people, but by the people don't get to be dog shit stupid and then act like it's not our fault. Like the entire premise of our country is that people actually have the capacity to participate in their own governance. And we can't sort of like get lazy and then blame the media.
Yeah, I don't know. The next editing copy you get of that book I'm working on will be, I guess, interesting because I try to tie all this together, and so maybe that book will be a little bit more controversial from your perspective than I thought it would be.
All right, Tyranny.
Well, there's a lot of discussion about tyranny in that book that I'm writing, so. One thing about news real quick, maybe we can cut it out, move it, or you can just let it flow anyway, who cares? One thing I want to point out, like all these news, when we're talking about news, there was a death just recently that none of these news are going to report on because they're not interested in news. They're op-eds. And that's of Christopher Allen Chopin, who was born in March 21st, 1976. He was a lawyer from down in West Palm Beach, got his BA from Emory, and went on and got his law degree, and just did a family business of a law firm that would have seemed like nothing that hit anybody's radar. But this was, on Twitter, he was at Actual Flaticus, known as Alan Smithy,
yeah.
Did a lot of quality digging into where the connections really were and following the money and doing the type of things that we should be hearing if these things were actual news.
Investigative journalism.
Yeah, and that's his death is a big loss, and it needs to be like factored out to people. He only had like 10,000 Twitter followers, but that's because his information wasn't going to be something that was talked about in the broad spectrum of media and what we consider news. And this is what he talked about was huge news, and his loss is huge news, and none of that will make the news.
So before we move on to tyranny, then for the next episode, for the audience, you'll have to wait a week, but we only have to wait like 30 seconds. But I want to bring back the issue of personal responsibility, because as a journalist and as someone who tried to do investigative journalism in Baltimore for a already struggling financially publication when I got there, a big part of why we don't get more quality journalism of the nature that you're discussing right now is because the audience doesn't give a fuck about investigative journalism and quality journalism of this nature. Because inevitably what is produced is too detail-oriented to hold their attention in the Twitter and Instagram era. Right? You only get 60 seconds of this video to explain this to me. But some things can't be explained in 60 seconds or 140 characters. And I think there's sometimes a conspiratorial sort of orientation that occurs on both the left and the right when they look at especially what is known as mainstream media. But I just have to say, as a journalist, believe me, the media is not pulling strings. They are trying to guess what you want and to give you that because they are struggling financially, and all they want is for you to pay attention to them. So they don't devote resources to 6-month, year-long investigations that, the nature of investigative journalism, you might dig and dig and dig and then not even produce anything because you don't really find something. What you thought maybe was there didn't turn out. right? And most news organizations today don't want to devote resources to a form of journalism that takes a long time, that produces stories that people who don't have doctoral level educations don't even bother to look at, and that costs money and might not even yield anything at all. And so I want to impress upon the audience that they might be looking at the media like these conspiratorial bad guys who aren't really interested in truth, but they need to look a little bit more at their own media behaviors to understand how they're sort of implicated and playing a role in this criticism that they are making.
Can I reply to that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously that's a huge conundrum and one that I can't solve either. So, but that has nothing to do with the facts of the situation of what these things should be. The lesser of two evils thing, that's the kind of thing though. Like, they won't listen to it, so what do you cater to? I think that kind of gets you into this broader lesser of two evils concept. And next thing you know, you're arguing about who hates Puerto Rico more, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and you don't really have a clear answer, which was a previous episode that we disagreed on. Moving on. So when I see any of these problems, right, my focus, I know I'm always attached to policing, but I have to always tell people, like, I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in systems and how these things work and how to make something happen and what are the hurdles. If there's a problem and you're trying to get from point A to point B, most people say, I can't. But if you say, why can't you, there's a reason. And whatever that reason is, there is a way around that. We can figure that out if we isolate what that reason is and try to do it. So when I think about, like, yeah, you have a hard time getting the money. But in the management world, we have corporate social responsibility becoming a much bigger thing, which requires you to think in longer term perspective. So let's think about the Boston Globe and what they did with the Catholic priest conspiracy and things like that. If you get in there and you get all the right kind of information, you get the right court cases, and then you have the story down solid, and you monetize that into the movie, into all the other things, then there are ways to get money out of it if you do really good controversial journalism where you get in there and dig into it. You just have a management problem that isn't thinking about how to broadly get these revenue sources. And that's why some of these newspaper companies are starting to get it together, where they've gotten new leadership in to start taking different perspectives and realizing there are ways to do this. You just got to think.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the industry right now is in the process of trying to figure out what the new landscape looks like. You can't, not every investigative journalism endeavor is going to lead to movie rights, right? Like that's not going to be a common outcome. And so there are ways, you're right, that and there are interesting and experimental ways in which folks are trying to monetize, especially investigative and other forms of hard journalism. But almost none of them up to this point are actually proving equal to the task of operation costs. And so,
yeah,
I mean,
but see, I really think, like, when we're even talking about those management issues, what I see is that people are investing in the type of journalism that fits their preconceived narrative.
Yes.
And that's in the same vein of the same problem. So maybe we need some kind of funding. Yeah, maybe we need some kind of funding for some kind of objective thing and have to think outside the box of how to do that. But
PBS, y'all.
These things, yeah, maybe. These things would change if we had the right I don't even want to say the right leadership or the right perspective.
I mean, this is the personal responsibility. I think you're right, they would change, but it would require that the audience not only support things that meet their preconceived notions, right? Until we as an audience are prepared to...
problem. I hear you, but I have this problem personally, right? So I have a hard time communicating the kind of concepts that I'm talking about, especially with policing, to the broader audience.
Definitely.
And, like, part of me wants to be like, the problem isn't me. The problem is that you aren't shutting the fuck up and listening to what I'm saying.
No, I think the problem is worse than that. I think you're right that the problem is your audience. The problem is that your audience wants both what you're saying and the opposite of what you're saying.
But it's ultimately, I have to figure out how to navigate that space. They're not going to change unless I provide something that will change the paradigm.
I think that's a messianic mission you've set for yourself, right? And just to highlight the difficulty of that mission, the person from whom we get the term messianic was literally crucified. So I'm just saying, I do feel like you're trying to save people from themselves, and the guy from whom we kind of borrowed that concept, it didn't work out that well. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I am trying to save people from themselves, but when it comes to systems, that's all I want people to see, is that it's the systems that I care about that you're creating, not you. And I don't know how to get people to see that.
And all I'm saying is, until people take responsibility for their insistence that they want to follow you but not follow you, that you can't do too much.
But my theory is,
like, you can overturn tables in the temple, but eventually you're going to get nailed to a tree.
But whether it's me, you, or somebody else, those people have to be provided with an experience that will cause that change.
But they also have to be open to that. And that's the one thing you can't control, right?
Because they have to have an experience that opens them to it.
No, of course.
That's just my theories.
No, I agree. And I'm not in disagreement. And this is where I think both it's a personal responsibility issue, but it's a communal responsibility issue. Like, we as a society have not created a context, and frankly, we haven't fought for a context in which people are open to information that doesn't confirm their immediate biases. And I think we need to address that as a society before we can address these broader problems.
Yeah, and I guess really kind of what the history of the world shows is that our governments are essentially just the codification of the ideas of a few smart people, and that's who's actually or powerful, and that's who's really run everything. And to a certain extent, yeah, I'm saying I have knowledge about a certain thing that you should listen to. And what I hope can be taken differently is that I am not telling you, my direction is to not tell you what to do, is to tell you how you enable your ideas. So if you don't listen to me, your ideas cannot have power.
Mike, I've been pulled over at least 3 times in my life. I think I know enough about policing.
Right. I know. Please don't give me that story, because it slowly grates, I think, my very existence on this planet every time somebody teaches me about policing.
Mike, I drove by an accident once and there was a cop there. And that made me realize.
Don't do it to me, Roberto. Just please.
This has been another episode of Nuance, a production of On Background Media Incorporated for StayUp.News. Intro and outro music provided by Baltimore's God Sense Beats. If you are a regular listener, please consider supporting our work, which you can do for as little as $1 a month. Simply go to patreon.com/StayUpNews, StayUpNews, all one word, and select your monthly donation and reward tier. Again, that is patreon.com/StayUpNews. On behalf of myself and Michael Wood Jr., thank you again for listening.